outcome for European farmers at this difficult time. I would say to Mrs Schreier-Pirik that in relation to pig meat, that I opened aids to private storage in order to recognise the difficulties in many member states for pig meat producers. This was open for about 10 weeks. It provided a withdrawal from the market of a significant tonnage from the pig meat sector from the market, and has certainly stabilised incomes for many pig meat producers. Of course, I also provided an opportunity for additional promotion measures for our pig meat sector, to replace some of the market share that was going to Russia, particularly in countries like the Philippines and the Far East, who are now occupying 73% of the products in the pig meat sector that were going to Russia. So market orientated policy that you have voted for and supported is working really in action in relation to how we are dealing with the pig meat sector. In terms of the application of financial discipline adjustment, it is important to remind ourselves that small farmers throughout the EU are exempted by the application of the €2,000 threshold, below which the adjustment rate does not apply. So I know when Mr Ashworth said earlier that a lot of the farmers in the UK, because of the farm structure and indeed other member states, will not have to pay this particular contribution, he is certainly reflecting the reality of the fact that the larger and medium sized producers are certainly the ones that are in a better position in order to pay for this particular measure. I know that Mr Agnew made another very valuable contribution for the UK to stay in Europe, because he will know better than anybody that when you look for €25 billion, which is the amount of money that the European Union are subsidising British farmers at the moment, it will be very difficult when you are competing with the public services around the cabinet table of a UK government. So the European Union is quite generous to British farmers, and rightly so, in addition to all of the other farmers in the UK, and I would subscribe that the EU will always be more supportive of agriculture and rural development measures in the UK than its own member state government. President, I want to conclude by repeating my welcome for the proposal, and I look forward to a positive vote tomorrow. Thank you.
Mulțumim domnului comisar și îl rog acum pe raportor, domnul Șechi.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I give the floor to the rapporteur, Mr. Sikierski.
Szanowni Państwo, Panie Komisarzu.
Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner, well, this is a formal, a technical report. This was obviously also a very technical debate, for which I am very grateful. The fast-track procedure for adopting this document means that there is a high degree of agreement between the Council, the Parliament and the Commission, which obviously is very important when we are reacting to difficult situations. We heard about solidarity, and yes, obviously, almost everyone except for the smallest one contribute to this fund, and the fund will be used by those who are affected by the crisis. So the solidarity plays a major role. We need to remember that agriculture is a very particular sector. We depend on weather, on external factors, also on the international situation. So we need instruments which are not always generated by the free market. Free market requires a certain support to really counteract certain crisis situations. And a major weakness of the CAP reform is the restriction of market intervention. I spoke about it before, and we have restricted the interventions too much. Obviously, we need a good management of the markets. We have less funds in general for the common agricultural policy and less funds for agriculture in general. We shouldn't say that it was the common agricultural policy that led to the crisis. It is not only farmers who are supported by the CAP, it's also the consumers, because this means cheaper food. And to conclude, I would like to thank the Presidency and the Commission once again for the cooperation. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you. That concludes the debate. The vote will take place tomorrow. Moving on, the next point of the agenda is the report by Mrs. NOICHL. It's the EU strategy for equality between women and women post 2015. The first speaker is Mrs. NOICHL.
Sehr geehrte Kolleginnen,
Colleagues, before I start talking about the EU's strategy for equality between women and men post-2015, I'd like to thank everybody who's worked so hard to put together a balanced strategy that particularly obtains for the shadows, their teams, and also a broad range of NGOs. And also thanks to the committee secretariat, your cooperation help was exemplary. Now the strategy has one main objective, and that is equality between women and men in Europe. We need to move ahead in the right direction. Now that objective was already in the first European treaties, but of course day-to-day life in Europe looks different. That is why we need a strategy with clear objectives and that points the way forward with clear solutions. 4 main objectives have to be at the heart of 500 million people live in very different situations in Europe. There are the old, the young, there are single people, families, people with or without disabilities, there are Europeans and people of different nationality. One main objective has to be to take account of this diversity so that everybody is covered. Secondly, good equality policy can be identified by topics not being looked at in isolation, but as being connected to other areas. So the aim of this is to put together a holistic strategy that takes account of these different points. Growth and employment are important points, but they shouldn't mean our gaze goes away from different issues as violence, media, time, finance, work, all of these things. The EU must promote equality in its foreign relations too. Thirdly, effective gender policy and equality policy is measured by 4 points. First of all, an honest assessment of the situation, the recognition of progress, identifying problem areas, and also recommending clear solutions. One of my aims is to look at realities and to make real, sensible, feasible proposals that will address these issues. Fourthly, responsible equal policy doesn't mean quick solutions. It takes time to bring about change. One main aim of objective is to acknowledge the importance of subsidiarity and to accept that what is politically possible is different. Best practice is particularly valuable to give suggestions to member states so that they can find their own way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, together with the shadows, we've managed to work together to incorporate all of these objectives in the report. A lot of ideas and proposals were made by European citizens, and they're covered here. Europe is a community of values. With the adoption of a strategy for equality between women and men, we are taking a step in the right direction, and we're doing that together with all men and women in Europe. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam, and also for keeping to your speaking time. That's exemplary, and I hope all colleagues will follow it. Now, on behalf of the Commission, Mrs. Jourová.
Honourable members, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the rapporteur, Madame NOICHL, for her report, which represents a key input for our future priorities in the area of equality. The Commission's commitment in this respect is as strong as ever. Equality between women and men is a fundamental value, an objective of the EU, and also a driver for economic growth. It is the Commission's firm intention to continue to promote equality in all European Union activities, internal and external, as required by the Treaty. My services have started a consultative process with major stakeholders and the broader public, as all the views and experience are very important in order to shape our future activity. I would like to thank the Parliament and in particular the FEMP Committee for its contribution to the Forum on the Future of Gender Equality in the European Union, organised this year in April. We are also cooperating closely with the Member States and other important stakeholders, such as social partners and civil society. We are interested in an inclusive process taking advantage of the expertise of others. Let me highlight the items where I believe we need together to step up our efforts: achieving economic independence in equality, the eradication of gender-based violence, the defence and promotion of women's rights and gender equality at the global level. This corresponds to a large extent to the priorities identified in your report. If we want women to be economically independent, we need to address the existing gender gaps, be they in pay, participation and pensions. As said in your report, we must also not ignore the high number of women living in poverty and social exclusion. Our tools are the monitoring of the situation in the context of the Europe 2020 strategy and the possibility to propose country-specific recommendations, the implementation and enforcement of the EU legislation, and the exchange of good practices and mutual learning. We should reflect on a new approach to tackle work-life balance. Both women and men should be able to fully participate in the labour market while not giving up on their family life. The challenges are to improve the accessibility to care facilities, effective rendition of family leaves and flexible working arrangements with particular attention paid to the participation of men. Also, we still need more women in positions of decision-making, be it in companies, the economy or in politics. Negotiations on our directive setting a 40% target for the under-represented sex in company boards are an absolute priority for us, and we need to conclude this proposal. Our approach is merit-based, putting the focus on a fair and transparent selection process, which will bring about significant change. As to violence against women, 1 in 3 women in the EU has experienced violence. We have to find policy responses that bring about a real improvement for the lives of women and girls in Europe. This includes looking into the possibility of the EU acceding to the Istanbul Convention. I strongly believe that the Council of Europe Convention is a powerful common framework to combat violence against women. When addressing violence against women, we need to combine the internal and the external perspective. I will work closely with colleagues Mogherini and Mimica to tackle the phenomenon of female genital mutilation as also beyond the EU. We will look at all available means to ensure gender equality, legislation and its effective implementation, funding of projects, campaigns, gender mainstreaming with specific measures. And we need a monitoring system with clear indicators to make ourselves accountable towards the EU citizens. I count on your support in working together to achieve equality between women and men. It is very important that the European Parliament sends a unified and strong signal on the future of gender equality policies in the EU. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kommissarin.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now for 1 minute, I give the floor to Ms. KOZŁOWSKA-RAJEWICZ on behalf of the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs.
Przewodniczący, pani komisarz.
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to underline in today's discussion the gender equality and its influence on the competitiveness of the European economy. Gender equality in the labour market is a matter of social justice, a fundamental right, but it's also a criterion for a stable economic growth. the improvement of one's qualification and using women's qualifications and talents is an asset to the economy. The presence of women in the boards of companies and in high positions is a very high asset. The presence of women in the labor market is also something that contributes to their pensions. We now have a 30% gap, a gender gap in pensions, so this should be a fundament on which we base our work. And we know that in order to achieve that, we need kindergartens, we need care facilities, and we need instruments that will enable a better work life.
Thank you, Madam. We now move on to the speakers on behalf of the political groups, the first of whom is Ms. GÁLL-PELCZ. 2 minutes.
Köszönöm szépen, elnök úr, tisztelt biztos asszony, tisztelt jelentés.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, Rapporteur, I think what you have already said here this afternoon is particularly important. It is essential that we all tackle this issue of gender equality because it's extremely important to all of us. The EPP group is supportive of these initiatives, and we are going to do our utmost to ensure that these initiatives are actually implemented. We need to work to finding common language as well as common objectives. Obviously, there are many of us representing a diversity of cultures, opinions, views and approaches. Obviously, there need to be country-specific recommendations. This is inevitable. I think in the opinions that have been expressed on behalf of our electorate, we have seen a reflection of the diversity of our societies. And it's very important that we adopt a report which reflects this, but which does the most we possibly can for our electorate. I have to say that there are some points where I'm not able to give my support to the report. For example, gender equality must not just become an instrument which is sometimes not used for the right purposes. I also think it's essential that we comply with the principle of subsidiarity and that we leave to the member states the areas of policy which can best be managed by them. I don't think we should be intervening in the affairs of other states, and we shouldn't be acting at a level where it's not necessary. Therefore, we need to delimit carefully the sphere where we do intend to act. Sometimes it can be damaging if you overstep the mark, and sometimes it can be equally damaging if you try to force the hand of others and insist that they implement measures which are perhaps not appropriate for their particular context. And therefore, the EPP group has looked at this report and the various points in it from this point of view, and we have expressed our view to some extent in an alternative minority opinion.
Jetzt die Kollegin.
And on behalf of the S&D group, Mrs. Arena, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Let me thank Ms. NOICHL for the work she's carried out in this report, which I think we can say is ambitious. It gets down to specifics and also gives you some legislative ideas, and in particular talks about financing. And I'd say to my EPP colleagues that if they come up with an alternative proposal, well, it's not ambitious at all, their alternative. It's not committed. It doesn't mention finance enough, and it doesn't have any legislative elements in it. So it's really a pity, I think, that this Parliament has not been able to send out a clear message. If we look back at what's happened, we know that we should do more. There's discrimination when it comes to work. There are employment conditions that aren't favourable to women today. There's the wage gap, there's the pensions gap. There's also moral discrimination, if you like. Women are victims of violence in Europe. They don't always have access to sexual and reproductive health care. We need to make sure that we put an end to this discrimination in Europe. And not just in Europe, of course. We want Europe to be a driving force as far as our external relations are concerned, so that we can then encourage others to bring in such equality throughout the world. Europe needs to be ambitious. It needs to do that. Parliament needs to pick up the gauntlet. As you've said, Madam Commissioner, we need a clear message from this House. And the NOICHL report does go in that direction, and we hope that all members of the House will vote for the NOICHL report, because we women need ambition, and I'd like to thank Maria Neuchel once again for the work that she's put in. Thank you, President.
Madame, est-ce que vous acceptez une carte?
Madam, would you be willing to accept a blue card from Mr. Nathan Gill? Mr. Gill, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, it's Raymond Finch, actually. I've just stolen Nathan's chair. Would my colleague agree with me that it's an utter disgrace that a debate on something as crucial as this is attended so poorly? It looks like there's no more than 20 or 30 people in the entire chamber. Thank you.
Alors c'est vrai qu'en général quand on...
Well, generally speaking, in discussing these issues, there aren't a lot of us here in the chamber. But what I do hope is that there'll be very many colleagues voting in favour of the report, so see you all tomorrow at the vote. I hope that all of us can support it. And it's not just because you're absent that it means you're not apprised of the challenges that we face on equality.
Merci.
Thank you. And now for the Conservatives, to Ms. Wiśniewska, 2 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing a controversial and dangerous report which is supposed to be a congruent strategy on behalf of gender equality. Such a perfect strategy should be an area for cooperation between men and women and should be based on equal chances and equal opportunities in a manner that actually appreciates the natural difference between men and women. However, there are no elements of equality in this report. We have here promotion of abortion, we have an intervention into education, because we have introduced gender politics on every level of education. We also have quota systems for company boards, and we also interfere with the integrity of families by promoting LGBT people, and also we have a fight against the traditional role of men and women, and it also requires the Commission and member states to participate in vitro procedures. So these are provisions that actually interfere with national provisions, and the report includes good and bad solutions. However, it's the bad ones that actually will cause a situation where we have a disabling of family institutions. These are the threats that are at the core of this report. We must not adopt this report. That is why tomorrow I will vote in favor of amendment number 1, that respects the division of competences between the European Union and member states, that also takes into account international law on health and family law. We must not allow that the idea of gender equality is just an area of futile ideological fights. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frau
Thank you, madam. There's a blue card for you too. Do you accept?
Akzeptieren Sie eine blaue Karte des Kollegen Arnott?
Do you accept a blue card from Mr. Arnott?
Yes, please.
About the principle of subsidiarity, that decisions should be made at the closest possible level to the citizen. Now it seems to me that we have something here where the decision is being taken further away. Do you agree with me that these matters really should be decided at a national level?
Zdecydowanie tak.
Well, decidedly so, yes, and that was also the spirit of my speech. These are decisions to be made by member states, and it is the member states who have the right to create their policy in this area. So yes, I think that adopting this report must not take place tomorrow. And also intervening with education, introducing the gender perspective on every level of education and showing that so-called stereotypical roles of men and women are the source of violence, and such a role for women is mother and wife, and for men it's the father role. So I think this is all wrong, and it's the member states that should decide on their family policy. Thank you.
Blue card, eine kurze Frage und dann eine
blue cards are shorter, half a minute usually. Now, Mrs. MLINAR.
Sehr geehrter Präsident.
President, Commissioner, first of all, I should like to extend my thanks to Maria Neuchel for the absolutely excellent work that she's done. I'd like to thank her because this is an excellent report. We voted it through committee and it very much regrets the virtual standstill that we've come to in working towards equality, and it demands of the Commission to put forward proposals which will genuinely achieve greater equality henceforth. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to contribute to such an important report which will genuinely change things for men and women and create much greater equality for women in the next 50 years. We have actually managed to put together a comprehensive package which should really deal with disadvantage right across the board. Women have difficulties on the labour market, for example, and right from the labour market to issues of assisted reproduction. These are areas that we've covered the whole gamut, and we have tried to put forward comprehensive proposals which we hope the Commission will take on board, because they will transform the position of women in Europe, and they will certainly promote much greater equality on a daily basis for our citizens. As we've heard from speakers already in the debate, there are colleagues who have opposed this proposal and are resting their arguments on this principle of subsidiarity. But I'd like to say, colleagues, please remember we're not voting on a legislative report tomorrow. We are voting on measures which we hope will actually help us to fulfill the objectives and values of the European Union, such as the Commissioner has already said. These should be shared and universal values which will help us to make reality of Article 2 of the Treaty. Article 23 of the Fundamental Charter also espouses the adoption of all measures to give greater equality to the underrepresented gender. So we're not talking about needing to look for a new legal basis or any such thing. And I think if we can adopt this report tomorrow, we will be sending a clear signal to everybody in Europe that Europe takes its responsibilities very, very seriously, and we want to make equality for women a reality. In this year 2015, there's not one single country the world over where women are actually on a par with men, where there is actually genuine equality. And we want to find the responses to these outstanding issues in this House and take them forward. Thank you very much.
Ich habe jetzt hier zwei Blue Cards.
Two blue cards for you. For one from a colleague that's got speaking time in debate, so I'll give Mr. Korwin Mikke the possibility of asking a blue card question. Mr. Korwin Mikke.
Thank you. We accept, I understand, that women and men have equal skills and talent. Unfortunately, when I am looking at TV, there is a program, Extreme Sports, and there are no women. In all the extreme sports, there are no women. I think you should demand that there will be at least 40% of women jumping on the motorcycles and so on. And moreover, there is a list of 100 best chess players. We should demand that at least 40% of the best chess players should be women. And of course, if necessary, we should change the rules of chess, because it's
Could you please ask a question?
To have at least 40% of women on the list of best chess players. Thank you very much. What do you think about it?
Frau Kollegin.
Madam.
I have to admit that I did not really understand what your question was, but however, if you try to refer to women maybe being less talented in chess than men, then I simply have to say that you are not right.
Für die Linksfraktion spricht jetzt für...
On behalf of GUE NGL, I'll give the floor to Mrs. Björk.
Först och främst skulle jag tacka rapportören, Ms. Noich, och de andra kollegorna i jämställdhetsutskottet för arbetet tillsammans.
President, Commissioners, I'd like to thank colleagues in the committee for the good cooperation. For the GUE NGL, gender equality is essential for building the kind of society we want to live in. A fair society based on democracy and gender equality, essentially, because otherwise it's not a real democracy. Now, colleagues, we've had hundreds, if not thousands, of years of patriarchy, and that's shaped our society. And the possibility of gender equality shouldn't remain a dream. The women must insist on their rights: right to work, right to inherit, right to contraceptives and so forth. So I'd like to thank everybody who's worked on this report, but we've got to keep working at it, and one has to wonder at the kind of resistance that we see. Now, not everyone is a feminist, but everyone is, it would seem, committed to developing a fairer society where everybody's got the same rights and obligations. And in future, we must work hard to ensure that women can enjoy economic independence. We must campaign against threat or threats of violence, and we campaign for a society where girls have more freedom. And we want a society where women know they've got the right to their own body and their own sexuality. And that's something that's got to happen out there in reality, not just on paper. Women don't want to live in a Europe of old men. We want progress to be made. And that's why this strategy is most welcome. The whole question of women on boards, what we have is not enough. Tomorrow we're adopting a report which is probably not enough, but it does move forward. There is a holistic approach, and therefore we must support it. And now, colleague, this isn't just about subsidiarity, but it's about whether you're in favor of women's rights or do you want to keep going with the patriarchal model. Tomorrow we'll be voting in favor of the resolution. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. I have a blue card for you. We just don't know exactly. Madame Bourse, is that right? Okay, wait a second. Do you accept the blue card? Please.
Yes. Thank you very much, colleague. Thank you. You just quote feminism. You were just talking about feminism then and discrimination. I just would like your opinion, please. If a gentleman, a male MEP, had stood up in this Parliament and said that men do not want to live in a Europe of old women, what would the feminists have said amongst us? I'm sure there'd be uproar. But that is just what you have said, and I personally find that equally offensive. I think discrimination has to work both ways, and as a feminist you can't stand there and make statements like that without then having the contrary backing it up. So to my mind, to say that women don't want to live in a Europe full of old men is just the same as a man standing up and saying a man doesn't want to live in a Europe full of old women.
Colleague, can I say this once and for all? I mean, we get many questions from the EFDD group. I'm happy to admit all of them. But they are supposed to be questions. What is the reality in your mind or not is not the question. The question is to be asked to the previous speaker in a precise and short manner so that she can answer. So please, do answer the non-question.
Thank you. In an equal society, I wouldn't dream of calling anyone anything. But in this society, I have been fighting for women's and girls' equal rights long enough, and I have met a lot of resistance, and believe me, that resistance is mainly from older men. And in this chamber, it's even more true. So I'm not taking it anymore. I'm not having it anymore. And I can name something for what it is. We see a lot of male resistance to gender equality in this room, and it has to stop. I want equality also in this chamber, by the way. Quotas tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nächste Rednerin für die...
The next speaker on behalf of the Greens is Terry Ranke.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, dear Commissioner, gender equality is not just the cherry on the cake of democracy. It is the very fundament of democracy and a founding principle of the European Union. Without full access for women to economic independence, without equal representation of women in our decision-making structures, without women having power over their own bodies, we will not reach full equality. The European Parliament cannot just claim this. We need to act and to propose legislation to really implement this equality, including basic rights such as sexual and reproductive rights. When we say my body, my choice, this statement means much more than just deciding over our reproductive organs. This statement means an empowerment to all women reclaiming the power over their own bodies, reclaiming a power and a right that we hold, but that has been taken away from us in the last hundreds of years. A right that is so simple and so clear that it makes me sad that we still have to fight for it today. And to the right side of this Parliament, it is simply untrue to constantly claim that asking for sexual and reproductive rights is promoting abortions. The exact opposite is true. Asking for sexual and reproductive rights means giving women back the power over their own bodies. It means fighting against the fact that still today, each year, 68,000 women die in unsafe and illegalized abortions. And I tell you here and now, if you want to fight against abortions, do not fight us. Do not fight the ones that are asking to have control over their bodies. Fight for empowerment of women. Fight for sexual education. Fight for free access to contraception. Fight for a society where women can take choices. Fight for sexual and reproductive rights. Because abortions are much more frequent, especially in illegalized and unsafe surroundings, in countries with very restrictive laws on abortion, where women do not hold the rights over their own body and where they do not have access to contraception. So, dear colleagues, please vote in favour of the initial report that has been proposed by Madame NOICHL and empower women to have a right over their own body. And when we are talking about women, we need to see the whole picture. Without acknowledging the diversity of our struggles, we will never reach full emancipation. Lesbian women, women of color, trans women, women with disabilities, poor women, young and old women, all their needs and demands have to be reflected in this joint strategy for gender equality post-2015. And yes, we will also need male allies, because this struggle is not only the cherry on the cake, as I said. It is a struggle that will change our whole society for all of us and that will make our societies more just, more inclusive and more resilient. So, if we want to be successful, we cannot only ask for the cherry on the cake. We can also not only ask to get a bigger part of this cake. We need to fight for the whole bakery. Let's build an equal, inclusive and diverse society. Let's not only make this strategy a cornerstone for women's rights and emancipation, let us go beyond, creating a comprehensive post-2015 strategy that will mainstream our demands in all fields of politics of the European Union.
You will need to answer.
Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for EFTD is Ms. Daniela AIUTO.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thanks, Mr. President. Colleagues, the goal of this report is to put together new strategies for equality between men and women in the European Union post-2015. And if you just look at how thick the report is, it just shows how much work remains to do in various areas. On the one hand, one should support and praise the attention given to issues such as discrimination at work, the wage gap, or the battle against domestic violence, calling once again on the Member States for the umpteenth time to ratify Istanbul. But on the other hand, in the report there are a series of aspects which are rather strange. In fact, what we are seeing here is the umpteenth attempt to arrogantly include issues which are presented as being the jurisdiction of the European Union, but it should remain within the power of the member states. If you read the title of the report, you expect a certain sort of thing to be in it, measures to promote equality between man and woman. But what you actually find instead is a series of issues which have got very little or nothing to do with that equality. I'd like the Women's Rights Committee's report not to be used to become wish lists, which are used then for the interference by one or other lobbies and dealing supposedly with issues such as equality. I'd like in fact to see some kind of education campaign on the question of equality, and to have explicit reference to education and emotional education, if you like, because if a boy grows up with awareness of respect for women, understanding what it means to love a woman properly, they would then be incapable when they grew up to abuse a future companion with psychological or physical violence. In fact, if you read the statistics, in the vast majority of cases, feminicides are carried out by the partner of the woman's concerned. So there are a whole series of positive aspects where we should focus and indeed need to work. One doesn't want to downplay the importance of strategies to try and solve the various problems which are linked to equality rate issues. Thanks very much.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. AIUTO. We now have Vicky MAEIJER, 1 minute. She's in the non-attached. Thank you very much, President. I have at least 40 pages of text on equality between men and women, criticisms of the member states, criticisms regarding maternity, paternity leave, childcare, household tasks, quotas and boards, parliaments, directorships. What on earth is this Parliament doing? This is a discussion that ought to be taking place in the national parliaments. It has no place here. 40 pages of text and there isn't a word about Islam and the implications that that has for equality between men and women, because there is no such thing as equality in the eyes of Islam, and a man is worth much more. A woman can't inherit, for example, in the same way as a man can. So this is an ideology which is an integral part of the European Union's culture, and yet doesn't recognise any sort of equality between men and women, and this is something that we cannot accept in our culture. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Sie haben eine Blue Card von Frau.
Thank you very much. Ms. BRESSO has asked for a blue card. Are you prepared to accept it?
U hebt een blauwe kaart. Ja? Accepteert u? Madame.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you, President. I don't know what you're accusing the EU of. You talked about these 40 pages which highlight problems which have been identified in individual member states, failing to respect the general rules of the EU and without violating the principle of subsidiarity, but there's a principle of coordination. So I haven't really understood precisely where you think the EU has failed. You should criticise the member states who have not been complying with their own rules for equality between men and women, which are indeed crucial European values. Thank you.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President, and thank you to Ms. BRESSO for the question. I've been a member of this Assembly for a year now, almost a year, and in all the texts I've seen about men and women and about equality, this one talks about all sorts of things like forced marriages and female genital mutilation, and these are all things which ought to be discussed in national forums, in national parliaments, I think that it's a breach of the principle of subsidiarity. That's the point I'm making. And the second thing I'm saying is, if you're so keen on equality, why do this Commission and this Parliament adopt all these reports without looking at the position of women in Islam? Why do you accept that? Why don't you look at it specifically? Thank you.
Für 2 Minuten spricht jetzt die Kollegin.
We now give the floor to Ms. Rosenberg for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. The fact that only women have asked for speaking time and men are using blue cards show that we haven't achieved our target here. We do need a strategy. I totally agree with Commissioner Jourová that the idea has to be to achieve equality, but we can't achieve that necessarily through reports which simply restate goals which we haven't achieved. What we need to do is work out how we, in the European Parliament or the Council or the Commission or the European Union as a whole, as an institution, how we can deal with this topic. But we can only do that, I think, by changing mindset, by changing our mentality, ladies and gentlemen. Change our idea. We've got the school, we've got the family, we've got the areas where children are educated, are brought up, where they become adults. It's important, therefore, that we hammer home the message of equality there. And that will definitely help people if we look at the 2 key issues of education and upbringing. Those are the most important points, I think, and at the moment we can have to say that we've not just actually failed to move forward, but we've actually moved backwards. Colleagues, it's not a question of the principle of subsidiarity, because national legislation does deal with these issues and we have an institutional role to play. We can intervene if we see that there has been a failure to implement European legislation. So the important thing, the lever for development, is changing people's mindsets. That has to be the object of all of this. And we can't simply continue with producing reports with intellectual content without any real ways of implementing them.
Thank you very much. Liliana Rodriguez has 2 minutes.
Thank you. I must praise Maria Neukell's report. We all know that the economic crisis and austerity measures were not rolled out equally and affected men and women differently. Women faced even more disadvantages during the crisis. According to estimates, there's been aggression in progress made towards gender equality, and we've got to give a sensitive and firm response to sensitive issues so as to overturn this backward trend. The adoption of this report will be an important step forward in that direction. I'd like to remind you that in most countries affected by the economic crisis, we've seen an increasing feminization of poverty. The main beneficiaries of food banks are women with children. Europe, there are a lot of single parent families made up of women, far more women than men. Many women many shelters for women against violence have been closed with the cuts. Women quite often end up in the informal sector, in poorly paid jobs, and face the risk of exploitation, the worst of which is trafficking. The freezing of pensions given austerity puts elderly women in a difficult economic situation, and women depend on tax benefits more than women. So all sorts of all of these factors tend to be ignored. A lot of governments have implemented austerity measures that exacerbate the negative effect of the economic crisis on women. That is why we must bear in mind the limitations to the economic autonomy of women, and we must acknowledge their right to a proper life. So we've got to adopt this report tomorrow. There are alternatives to breaching human rights. We've got to come forward with these alternatives, and I regret the fact that the other side of the chamber doesn't want to carry out any changes.
Für 2 Minuten die Kollegin.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Beatriz von STORCH, has 2 minutes. Thank you. After Estrella and Tarabella, we have the NOICHL report. I could quote Article 16, where it says the European Parliament demands that the European Parliament should put in place sex education programmes in school. Is this possible? Is it possible that we would actually be suggesting that there wasn't enough, that we should have a course in fundamentals of this rather than the fundamental rules of the European Union? The European Union and the European Commission are not responsible for this. Sex education is just not something that we're responsible for. Is this something on which we should be trying to legislate? The WHO is not asking us to be their regional office and to establish sex education programs for them. For example, developing positive attitudes to social interpretations of gender and looking at early models of child education and issues like masturbation. Now, this is something where I'm extremely concerned to see these sorts of comments being made. I think that you've got to look at the roles of parents, and you've got to strengthen the role of parents and support them where they need it. You've got to strengthen the family where it needs to be strengthened, but please let them bring up their children. In point 31 of the report, it talks about the European Parliament looking at the whole issue of the definition of families, and it talks about single-parent families. Now, this is not something, I think, on which the European Union is competent. Should we have one sort of family law for single parents and another for couples? This is crazy. I think there's more and more resistance to this within the European Parliament, but there certainly is outside of the streets, and I think that really this is a complete waste of taxpayers' money. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin. Es spricht jetzt
Thank you very much indeed. Beatriz,
Thank you, President. Commissioner. Thanks, Mrs. Neuchel, for having done such a fine and ambitious job as based on consensus. Now, why are we talking about gender equality? Because it's an aim, because it's something that is as yet unachieved. Assessments of the current strategy suggest that we've achieved some objectives, but progress has been uneven and too slow, and there's still a lot of challenges we need to take up. Regrettably, in the European Union, we've got examples of member states that are backsliding on equality. The beneficial effects of gender equality are proven for society at large and also in the economic, social and political fields. It's the best guarantee of a fair society based on fundamental rights that actually mean something. The European Union recognizes gender equality in the treaties as an aim and a value, so that's why this report is particularly important. It's got a strategy for the European Union for the next 5 years. The European Parliament must send out a clear and determined political message on progress towards gender equality, and it must also send out a message to international actors such as UN. They're waiting for that clear signal which will back up their work on this front, and that's of course part of the development agenda 2050-2030. Mrs. Jourová, this strategy will be the first major job performed by a commissioner that has gender equality as part of her portfolio. Let's look at the errors of the past and not repeat them. There's been a lack of resourcing and limited capacity, but the necessary resources must be targeted so that we ensure results are proceeded, and also there must be clear timetables and tangible objectives. In the women's rights objective, we've taken note of the problems and made a balanced proposal which seeks to respond to all problem areas where there are problems. There's been improvement of the rights of LGBTI people in the European Union. There are more women in company, and once again I would urge you to sign or get the European Union to sign the Istanbul Convention. That means the Commission has to come forward with a proposal. Council is waiting for that. Thank you.
So, wir kommen jetzt zum ersten.
Thank you very much. We now call our first male speaker. Kostas CHRYSOGONOS has 1 minute.
We're talking today about the adoption of a new strategy for equality between men and women, Mr. President, at a time when the utter failure of the previous strategy, 2010 to 2015, can be shown through some figures. 60% of those people who are without a job are women. But also, for those women who have a job, they are, on average, paid 16% less than men for work of the same value. And these figures are increasing in crisis countries such as Greece, where, because of the memorandum policies that have been brought in, huge numbers of women are without a job. These high-sounding words in the report aren't going to help either the mother without a job, or the girl who doesn't want to get pregnant because she's afraid that she'll be fired, or the woman who's a victim of violence. The austerity policies aren't just not promoting the equality between men and women, but are worsening inequality between the two, and we need to overturn this whole thing. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Für 3 Minuten.
Thank you very much. Ernest Maragall has 3 minutes.
Presidente. Thank you, President. This is an ambitious resolution that has been well drafted. And I'm pretty surprised that some people see it as excessive or indeed dangerous. I think it's really rather prudent and could have gone further. But anyway, we're definitely going to be supporting it. On gender equality, we need more and better Europe. It's not, the idea is not to replace the member states, but to complement and assist countries and regions to move ahead towards this shared objective of gender equality. Can I mention 3 specific: education, economic crisis, market. Education. This hasn't been stated yet. Early childhood education plays a very important role. It's been clearly proven that this produces a massive impact on personal independence and on gender equality. There's a clear positive correlation between early childhood education and this attitude. Also, education, the training of teachers is fundamental if we are to achieve success on this front. Secondly, economic crisis and new waves of migration. Europe has fallen back on this front. The economic crisis has clearly damaged gender equality. We've fallen prey to the alleged benefits of the market, and we've been punished by austerity policies and budget cuts. Furthermore, new internal migratory ways further render realities complex. There's a great deal more very varying time, or rather mindsets, which react differently to European values. So the European Union must adopt policy. The European Union can't just follow up. It's got to be much more proactive and promote and support each country. That means helping them define objectives, giving them resources and shared monitoring of implementation of such progress. Finally, the market and social risk. The free market has been imposed. We've been encouraged to consume without trammel, and a lot of promotion of masculine and feminine roles are promoted in this. This is a deregulation model, the globalization model, which we have had imposed for 30 years. We're not going to make any progress on gender equality without changing course. It makes no sense for all public policies and all education efforts to be cancelled out by social economic behavior which day on day confirms stereotypes granted or accorded to each gender. There's got to be a change. The feminine stereotypes for sure, but also masculine stereotypes, which means dominational power models which are based on feminine subordination at some scale. Well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kollege. Nächste.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for 3 minutes is Louise BOURS.
Thank you. The resolution urges the adoption of a directive for the balanced representation of men and women on boards. Now, this is a piece of EU legislation that allows sanctions, such as the dissolution of a company, just because it hasn't succeeded in reaching the arbitrary target imposed by the European Union. You don't fight discrimination with discrimination. Bringing in quotas is demeaning. for women, the women who have worked hard and made it to the top of their professions. It shouldn't matter what gender you are, what your ethnic background or religion is. If you're the best qualified person for that job, you should get it. But with the instigation of these policies, people could look around the boardroom and question whether a colleague is the best person for the job, or did they simply obtain their position because their gender ticked the right boxes on the EU checklist. Now, paragraph 56 calls for the EU Commission to create best practice models of sex and relationship education for young people. Paragraph 60 urges the Commission to implement sex education programmes in schools and ensure counselling and access to contraception. It is outrageous, absolutely outrageous, that the EU seeks to interfere with member states' education systems, especially with regard to sex education. And to top things off, in the explanatory statement, you even say who should be doing the housework. If I can quote directly from it, men will have to devote more time to the housework. Now, what kind of organisation interferes to this extent in the private lives of people, their marriages, their partnerships? It's up to adults in the privacy of their own homes to decide who does what. It's not the place of any government, and it certainly is not the place of EU bureaucrats to decide who does and who doesn't do the dishes. In 1975, the UK voted to join a Europe of free trade and friendship, not a European Union of political control and social engineering. This is yet another reason to vote no in the upcoming UK referendum. Let us regain our freedom and independence from these meddling EU bureaucrats.
Colleagues, I do get some requests for blue cards from colleagues who have already spoken in the debate. I do not grant these blue cards because we have an agenda that goes on till 11 p.m. And so you're not accepting it anyway. That's reassuring. So the next speaker then will be Mylène TROSZCZYNSKI for 1 minute, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Défendre les femmes.
Thank you, President. Defending women in the difficult task of striking the fragile balance between their family and work lives is something we all agree on. We also have to defend the rights of the most vulnerable human beings who are often dependent, such as children, older people, or people with disabilities. That's a struggle we should all be fighting, and it is something completely outside the terms of reference of this House. I'm struck by the terrible contradictions within this report, particularly the goals and the means it intends to use to pursue them. How is it possible to defend women by trying to do away the differentiation of sexes? How can you protect the most vulnerable by defending the right to abortion as being inalienable? Now, how can you defend the family by destroying its basic conception? Your intellectual theories are completely disconnected from reality. This report will not be of any help to anyone, certainly not to women, and once again it will switch off the voters unless the European Union gets rid of some of these ideas which are killing it off.
Vielen Dank. Für 2 Minuten.
Thank you very much. For 2 minutes, Michaela ŠOJDROVÁ.
Vážený pane předsedající.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to tell my colleague.
Благодаря, господин председател. Аз бих искал да кажа.
Bohužel v té zprávě se nepodařilo najít dobrý kompromis při hlasování na výboru a ta zpráva se nesoustředí.
Sorry, we have the clock will be set back so you can start again, but I don't get translation in German and you don't seem to be getting it in English either. Could we ask the technicians to check what's going on?
Yeah, rozumíte?
Do you understand now? Can you hear the English now? Can you hear the English translation now? Yes? Can you hear the English, please?
Do restart. Thank you very much.
Děkuji.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. What I wanted to say was that I wanted to respond to Ms. Björk, my colleague. Even though I'm not an old man, I will be voting against the NOICHL report, because even in the FAM committee we have not succeeded at finding the right balance, a right compromise, because this report does not focus on what is really important and on the strategies that really would be able to help. Even though we have not been able to increase women's salaries, we still have this 16% gap, gender gap in the EU. There is still a 39% gap in pensions for men and women. And even though we do have relatively large representation of women at universities, this does not correspond to the percentages of women in high political positions, in company management boards, etc. So I think this report does not respond to the reality. Why is it? Why are women paid less than men? Well, this is natural, because women have another essential role in which they are irreplaceable, and that is their role as mothers. And that is why, of course, they are in a way, let's say, handicapped to a certain respect in their professional careers. And as a result of incompetent or inadequate measures, most European nations are dying out. The EU does not have a problem with women not having sufficient access to abortions. There are plenty of abortions in the EU. The problem is that women are not being supported enough in reconciling the work and life balance, which is why our group has brought this new position which addresses the real needs, the real issues, which is to support women, to provide more flexi time for them, to provide more incentive for companies, and to focus on the lowering on the gender gap in salaries. And I believe that the European Parliament will be able to issue a strong signal in this respect.
Vielen Dank. Für 2 Minuten.
Thank you very much. For 2 minutes, Anna Hed.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you very much. I am a mother to 3 children. I am not disabled, and nothing prevents me from sitting in a parliament. The general gender pay gap in Europe today is 16.4%. In other words, women earn 16.4% less than men, despite the fact that they have the same jobs, that they take care of the same duties. Now that injustice arises as a result of several factors. First of all, it's because men have pretty much always dominated decision-making positions. They therefore have control over the attribution of wages, and it is also because women have long been considered just a means for reproduction, which means that women workers are seen as less reliable than their male colleagues because they are expected to at some point give birth to children. The fact that men and women are dealt with differently is not just a problem for now, it also paves the way for enormous problems in the future, because the gender pension gap in the EU is set to rise to 39%, which means that women are in an untenable position throughout the whole of their lives. Women, of course, account for more than half of Europe's population, and yet only 18.6% of board members are women in the EU, and only 5% of those who lead these boards are women as well. So it's high time for us, as a first step, to really take a look at the measures that are required in order to make sure that women are afforded the same opportunities as men when it comes to directing businesses and companies. Also, we need to break with this norm according to which men have a higher value than women when it comes to wage attribution. And if it's not obvious to you already now how important this is, then I think I need to point out to you that if there were equal participation on the labour market, it would lead to an increase in GDP per capita by 12.4% between now and the year 2030. Now, the couple of points I've mentioned just now are just a few examples of the injustices that women suffer from today. This injustice must come to an end, and Mrs. Maria Neuchl's report is a very good instrument for that. If we don't vote in favour of her report and the FEM committee's report, then I'm afraid women's economic independence and liberty will be jeopardised once again, as so often in the past. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. For 1 minute, Jana ŽITњANSKÁ.
Thank you very much, Chairman, dear Commissioner. I also dream and wish for a Europe without discrimination, and I wish for a world where a high quality and inclusive education becomes a reality for all, for boys and girls, for poor people, for children with handicaps, not only in Slovakia but also in all the other countries of the European Union. And I dearly wish for not having to solve the problem of access to education in the 21st century, and I wish that we could direct this energy into supporting education for girls, even in technical areas. But this support is very different in different member states, and that's why I believe it is inappropriate to introduce new legislation and set quotas which should be part of the remit of the member states, not the European Union. And I'm deeply convinced that if we want to help girls and their education, we should do so now, and we should do so through very patient work on the level of the member states to improve their status later in their life.
Thank you very much, Madam. For 1.5 minutes now, Mrs. Bilbao.
Gracias.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Real equality between men and women is of strategic importance for Europe. It's a question of justice and fundamental rights, particularly the fight against gender-based violence, a silent scourge which threatens millions of women. The success of our 2020 model will furthermore depend on incorporating women's capacity and talents into the labour market and getting them involved in the process of taking decisions in the private and public spheres. Using this human capital is vital. It's intelligent, sustainable, and it will bring about integration. That's what will give us a great competitive edge vis-à-vis competitors whose attitudes on these matters are still virtually medieval. This has to be an across-the-board vector built into the whole policy platform of the European Union. We need statistics to provide proper indicators, publish the results of investigations, and ensure that we get real equality. That means that men have to be actively involved in the process too. We need only ask about what can bring about equality. Unfortunately, there are poor examples in the makeup of the Commission, or the Council's prevarication on extending maternity leave, or the scandalous situations we've seen here on sexual and reproductive health debates. All these are sorry signs of the distance between what we say and what we actually do. So let's move from words to deeds. And backing this report is the first step in that direction. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
The next speaker is JUARISTI for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. When it comes to women's empowerment and participation in politics and society, it is absolutely necessary for us to make sure that governance is made more democratic, that we also give incentives to participation when it comes to public bodies. But in addition to setting targets, we also need to have funding available. And we need to have specific budgets for equality policies, and we need to guarantee that the gender perspective is something that is really mainstreamed into EU policy, and of course into our budget as well. And this, for the time being, it's something that is on paper. We need to now make it reality. We need to make it cross-cutting, and we need to make it effective. The same holds true to education and strategies when it comes to societal transformation. It is essential. The European Union, at this point in time, when talking about structural inequality and talking about the very manifest and different types of violence against women, we have fallen short of the mark. Now, of course, you might question whether this is a matter for the EU or for the member states. Now, in some member states, unfortunately, this is not being dealt with sufficiently well for now. Thank you.
Yes, el próximo orador.
Thank you. The next speaker for 3 minutes, Sebastián.
Señor Presidente, queridos colegas.
Thank you, President. Colleagues. Commissioner, thank you. First of all, we should recall that the 5 priority areas of the European Equality Strategy 2010 to 2020 still apply. Sadly, they're still topical because we haven't managed to solve any of these problems. We don't yet have economic independence for women, nor equal pay, equality in decision-making fora. We haven't brought an end to gender violence, and we haven't built the gender perspective into our external policies. The post-2015 strategy is therefore a matter of urgency. It's crucial if we're going to get real equality coming through. And that equality is the only way we can really fulfill our promises on human rights in the European Union. We can't therefore adopt a weak strategy without strict goals that can be gauged. That's why I welcome this report with the necessary amendments, and I'd like to pay homage to the rapporteur for the work that's been done on this. We need to send out a very clear signal to the Commission that gender equality is not a secondary concern. This isn't just something we need to work on because feminists are very persistent. It's something absolutely vital. We've had reports from the position of women in India and Africa, forced marriages, systematic rape, and in Europe we need to gauge the terrible situation women face. There are still those who are scandalized when we talk about building the gender perspective into every policy area. Now, the fact is we do have terrible problems in Europe. One of our colleagues said earlier on that 1 in 4 women have suffered violence from men at some point in their lives. The Commission has to take a tough line and call upon those member states who haven't yet done so to ratify the Istanbul Convention. And we need the European Gender Violence Directive to go through. The legislation in those countries that conceal it under the concept of crime passionnel or whatever must be brought to book. Europe's position must be clear in these strategies. When we talk about the right to sex education and sexual health rights, of course we have to call for action in these areas, because equality amongst all the citizens of the European Union is a vital goal. Have we forgotten that? It's written into all the treaties. Those parties in the majority here agree with the treaties, don't they, in the countries they govern? So why come along here and say that Europe is encroaching on the national sphere? The only way to uphold that equality is to act in the area of education too. Macho stereotypes remain. They're even getting stronger amongst European youth, and the future's not looking very rosy. If Europe means anything, it's the possibility it gives us to unite our efforts for the benefit of our citizens. We can go beyond what the national states seem able to do. In the area of gender equality, the national states are clearly failing, so this is a struggle for the whole of Europe.
Muchas gracias, molt gracias. Next speaker for 1 minute, Sylvie Godin.
Thank you very much, President. Once again, this is a very militant report on equality between men and women, so militant that it turns this fight against violence against women to favour LGBT rights and other aspects. Now, in this report, we talk about harassment, forced marriages, FGM, salary differentiation, and discrimination against pregnant women. But it also contains a number of elements that do not support women and do not come under the responsibilities of the European Union, and it isn't acceptable that member states be called upon to recognise assisted reproduction as a right and not to uphold the rights of children. This assisted reproduction ends up making a market of women's bodies, and if we favour illegal immigration, that's not going to favour women. And what happens in our schools doesn't help. To deprive many children of their fathers does not help women. Ultimately, this report doesn't do any favours for women at all. Mr. President, thank you very much. For 2 minutes, Angelika MLINAR next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President, Commissioner, dear colleagues. Gender equality is a very important topic, and it has been mentioned already, the fact that so much still remains to be done. For instance, the pay gap of 16% throughout the European Union, a gender pay gap, that's one example. Also, of course, poverty in old age for women, and the whole issue of violence against women, a very thorny issue. There's a lot to be done. Mrs. Neuchl's report, it's her first report. I would like to support it, but unfortunately I can't, because in the report there's a fair amount of content which I can't actually agree with, and therefore I would like to support the alternative resolution which has been tabled by our political group. I would like to appeal to you to support that, because in this alternative position, we talk about those issues that have to do with our remits, those of the member states, for instance, family planning, issues of health. Once again, these are not European issues, they fall to the member states. Education and training is not really for the EU, it is once again for the member states to settle these points. It's their remit. Now, it needs to be made clear that not every topic is within the remit of the EU, and that's why, unfortunately, I can't support this report, but I hope that we get a majority for the alternative position tomorrow. Now, the EU is doing a lot of work in this area, for instance, trafficking in women, forced prostitution, the fight against those phenomena. It is an absolute disgrace what's happening in our member states, in the European Union, the kind of goings-on before our very eyes. And I think that here we really are called upon, all of us, to act together. The European Commission must do something, because this is organised crime we're talking about, organised trafficking, and we need to therefore fight that battle in the interest of women. There, yes. But as for the remainder, the member states must do their homework when it falls within their remit, and they are best placed to do so. Thank you.
There is a blue card by Mrs. Grappini. Is that okay?
Per favore.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte.
Thank you, President. Dear colleague, you said here, and not only you mentioned subsidiarity. You said that member countries should be in charge of their own problems. Today we are discussing facts. We are discussing the fact that these problems are not being solved at the national level. So then why don't you agree that we need such a report, that we need a European Union program by means of which we should be able to reach this goal that we have, that is equality of chances for women in all fields of activity. Why don't you agree that once we have this situation, if we let each and every country to do whatever they want, then we have no results?
Madam, I'm going to have to interrupt you. The same applies to you as I said to another group. A blue card gives you an opportunity to raise a question, not to hold your own speech. Mrs. Niebler, for a response.
I can be brief. I would maintain my stance. There are certain subjects that fall within the remit of our member states, exclusively so, even if it's a problem. Of course, it's a problem that we here in the European Parliament can identify as a problem, but nevertheless it doesn't fall within our remit, unfortunately. That is my point. So if there are problems to be solved at member state level, then we have to leave that to the member states. We can't actually supplant our member states here at European level. So it is for them back home to deal with these issues. And that is why I believe that it would be appropriate to support our alternative resolution, because a lot of the individual issues are addressed in that paper, and I think that that's the best way of proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For 2 minutes, Mrs. Hannibal.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like also to thank Mrs. Neuchel for her comprehensive and very valuable report. Much earlier in the debate, Madam Arena said that we need to send a clear message to ourselves, to the European Union, to the European Commission, to the citizens about gender equality. And I think there is one particular issue which has already been mentioned, which is very, very important, and that is the whole matter of trafficking in human beings, which is one of the most lucrative criminal activities in the world today. And of course, the vast majority of victims of trafficking are women. 80% of victims of trafficking in the EU are women, and most of them, as we know, are trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation. And we really must do everything that we can to end what is, in effect, modern slavery. We all know there is a directive on human trafficking, but the problem with it has been its implementation. Maria Neuchel, in her report, calls on member states to fully implement the anti-trafficking directive, and we must do everything that we can in our own member states to make sure that this has happened, because this is one of the areas where the EU has huge competence and is the only organisation that can deal with it, because human trafficking is something which has to be done across borders and across countries and across nationalities. We know that our citizens want this, and I know it as a representative of London, which is one of the destinations for trafficked women. So we therefore, I think, have a particular responsibility, not only in terms of gender equality in itself, but particularly in human trafficking. And I would say that human trafficking is important for gender equality because the women involved are poor and they're vulnerable. Therefore, I ask on all of you to support the report and vote for it tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Nächster Redner.
The next speaker for 1 minute is Anne Gericke.
A-R-I-T-Y. Subsidiarität, liebe Kollegen.
That spells subsidiarity. If I could make that point to the colleague sitting to my left, this new report is another piece of evidence that subsidiarity is sorely lacking when it comes to the implementation of certain issues. We should perhaps concentrate on the matter in hand, opportunity in life, and when it comes to the equality between men and women, between parents with or without children, well, we tend to end up in absurd posturing with this kind of thing. So I'm wondering, who is the gender whisperer here? Mrs. NOICHL, many people from the SPD won't like your report, people who don't want abortion. What I suggest is that you go back to your electorate and with it the best of luck. Altogether, the EPP and the ECR have put their list of reports together, and interruption by the President. We have produced an alternative resolution, and I would ask you to support this alternative resolution tomorrow. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Und wenn Sie eine Minute.
You have a minute, so I would ask that in future you keep to that 1 minute. Next speaker is Gesine Meissner for 1.5.
Thank you very much, President. Yesterday I read an article about Saudi Arabia, an editor there, the fact that women can't drive cars there. A woman has to ask her husband if she wants to travel anywhere. Now, fortunately, in Europe, we're not in that sorry state of affairs, but having said that, not everything is perfect here either. So we're talking about the European Union, and if we think that women and men should have equal access to all areas, as long as that isn't achieved, we haven't achieved equality either, as long as that is questioned. And in actual fact, equal opportunities and access are not there. We know, of course, that women and men are different, and of course we deal with one another in everyday life. That is fine. We're equal there, but what about employment? What about politics? I think that it's important for us to harness the individual capabilities of women and men. Mixed teams work best. We know that from experience. So why don't we do that? Why is it that in politics we still don't have enough women? So we need to be more successful. We need to do more. That is clear. As for the pay gap, the fact that we have a pay gap, not the same remuneration for the same work, that is simply unacceptable. It is not something that we can tolerate, and we therefore must fight that. Reconciling family life and professional life. Fathers too want to do this, and we need to facilitate that. Discrimination, we don't want any kind of discrimination, not vis-à-vis men, not vis-à-vis women, and of course the whole issue of violence against women is a terrible one, and that is something that we need to do something about internationally. Female genital mutilation, violence against women in war situations, it is absolutely untenable and unacceptable, and that's why the report is so good and has so many components in it. Please vote for it tomorrow.
Für eine Minute jetzt.
Thank you very much, Tania González-Peñas for 1 minute.
The proposals in this report are positive, but they'll only be truly useful if we fight the root causes of inequality. It's not a straight line. The austerity policies of recent years, with the cuts to social expenditure and public services, are pushing back many of the advances we had achieved. More and more women are being condemned to poverty and precarious living conditions, which means that once again they find themselves invisible, carrying out tasks that should be regarded as social services that everyone is entitled to. We should also talk about maternity and paternity. That's very much a live topic in this House. Without paternity leave and maternity leave on an equal footing, paid for 100% and non-transferable, if we don't include maternity leave, then we're just going to perpetuate the role of women as carers, separate from the labour market, and finding it much harder to get a job. It's a question of justice, but also economic sustainability and the sustainability of our society. We need to make sure that there are proper social and economic guarantees for all these rights.
Für 3 Minuten spricht jetzt.
Thank you very much. For 3 minutes, Igor Šoltes.
Thank you for the floor, dear colleagues. The report on the strategy of the European Union on the equality of men and women post 2015. I fully support this report. It is an ambitious report by our colleague which draws our attention to a series of problems which have been persisting for a number of years. It is only right we are discussing this because gender equality is one of the basic values of the European Union, which has been included already in the treaties and the Fundamental Rights Charter. And even though we are advocating this principle of gender equality, at times it seems that this is a process which hasn't been completed yet, and on the contrary, it is slowing down in recent years. Also, perhaps the strategy of the former Commission was a bit weak. The new strategy should give new impetus and bring new results to increase the equality of men and women. We should not persist on backward approaches to division of work among men and women, unsustainable models, and this precarious labor relations which added to the poverty of women in certain areas. And this is in the remit of the European Union to really increase the measures and really work on reducing gender inequality. This is crucial if we want to move on. Of course, not just on a declaration level, similarly as in the cases of youth unemployment and aging society. If we don't take another approach, we will be discussing the same problem next year. Therefore, more decisiveness is needed. And as our colleagues say, it is the matter of subsidiarity, of decision-making within the family and intimate decision. But nevertheless, there are problems like violence against women, which is taking place primarily in families. So this is something we should discuss, and subsidiarity is certainly one of the aspects of these discussions for the future. But I believe that the role of the European Union is here very clear, and that's why I fully supported this report.
Herr Scholtes, Sie haben eine blue card.
Mr. Scholtes, Mr. Jakovčić has a blue card for you. Will you accept?
Ivan, bitte.
Thank you, Mr. Scholtes, for accepting my blue card. I would like to ask, because I was following your presentation very carefully, do you agree with me that equality, freedom, health came before subsidiarity? So do you think that equality, freedom, health are higher values than subsidiarity? Although I am certainly for subsidiarity, but would you agree with me in this?
Dear colleague, of course, these are the values which were created also before they are part of our civilization, the fundamentals of our civilizations. But it seems that we are violating these concepts in an unacceptable way, and the differences are increasing in many areas. And therefore, I believe that subsidiarity should be also observed as a principle within the treaties. It should be observed in a way to preserve the values you mentioned.
Vielen Dank. Eine Minute jetzt für Diane.
1 minute for Diane Dodds now.
Thank you, Mr. President. This report focuses on many important issues. It focuses on tackling domestic violence, providing access to essential skills, and the need to support a work-life balance for young mothers. I fully support efforts to make 2016 the European Year for Combating Violence Against Women, and I regret that in recent correspondence with the Commission that they seem to lack urgency in making this a reality. I would recommend to the House Lord Morrow's human trafficking bill in Northern Ireland as a good example of national legislation which tackles this evil primarily directed against women in our society. However, much of this report is a matter of subsidiarity, and it is wrong for this Parliament and European bureaucrats to seek to intrude into national life in this way. As a member of this Parliament from the United Kingdom, I am looking forward to the debate in our forthcoming referendum, and I have no doubt that this kind of interference will be high on the list of people's concerns.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. And now for 2 minutes, I call Mrs. Barbara Matera.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. I regret to see how the annual report on women's rights and gender equality, setting out the course for equality, is used by certain political groups within this House to impose their own ideologies. Just a few months ago, Parliament gave its backing to Mr. Tarabella's report. That was much better balanced and more specific. It was a team job. On this occasion, however, well, I'd like to pay my compliments to Ms. GÁLL-PELCZ, the Shadow Rapporteur, for her efforts in trying to end up with an alternative motion for resolution, which I would commend to people in the vote tomorrow. I think it's surprising how many of our left-wing colleagues in this House ignore the limits written into the treaties. There's a whole chapter here talking about health. That's really quite a paradox. For those of us who are members of the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee, an effective strategy intended to remove any type of discrimination against women is a vital opportunity to, having a report on this is a vital opportunity to turn to the Commission and get it to focus on the real problems. Better cooperation, I'm sure, would have worked to the benefit of women who in 2015 still have to work 3 months more than a man to earn the same pay. Women who are victims of violence, and those women who are still forced to work twice as hard to obtain senior positions in their firms. I am winding up, President. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, said that there's no better sign of the progress of civilization than cooperation, and I'm very sad that we didn't manage to achieve better cooperation in our committee on this report.
Thank you. And now for 2 minutes, Mrs. Steinbrück.
First of all, thank you to Maria Neuchel, my colleague, for a very good report. And listening to the discussions here, it seems to me that sometimes we're back in the Middle Ages, and subsidiarity is what people are saying needs to apply. We've had all these fine words and promises for a long time saying that the discrimination against women is about to end, particularly in the labour market, but too little actually happens. And the alternative proposal strikes me, and this is something that our conservative colleagues have put forward, is purely cosmetic. Whether you've got a good job maybe you're a manager, maybe you're in a precarious labour situation, and what your earnings are. Well, women are not more stupid or worse educated than men, and if you add work in the home to that equation, women do a lot more and should earn a lot more. There have always been these positive initiatives in the EU to bring about equality between men and women, but the commitment that should follow that has been lacking, and in these times of economic crisis it's tended to be women that have lost jobs, that have got the worst paid jobs, that have had to work part-time against their will. Europe has to actively set about solving these problems, as it does in other policy areas, such as fighting youth unemployment, for example. Measures to reduce the so-called gender pay gap have fallen victim to the economic crisis or competition. Women are affected more by poverty in old age. They have lower earning prospects, and it is much more difficult to combine a career with looking after children or care. And all of this is down to the fact that women are actually in a worse position in the labour market. So what we need are binding targets within the EU 2020 strategy, and in particular in the labour market. Bringing about equality is not taking people unseriously. It's actually giving them their rights.
I don't see our colleague Mrs. Görling. Gericke hat aber schon eine blaue Karte.
You've already had speaking time, I'm afraid, despite your blue card. That's our system. 1.5 minutes in that case for Mrs. Veldmans.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter, mevrouw de
Thank you, President. Commissioner, colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank the rapporteur for the comprehensive and ambitious, very specific report. My compatriot Maria Arena has already pointed out this is a very ambitious, palpable report, but let's be realistic about this. It's really a source of shame, isn't it, that we're here in the year 2015 having to have a debate on equality between men and women, which still has not become a reality. For us, as liberals, it's self-explanatory. We've got to work for the future. From what I've heard tonight in this debate, not everyone seems to agree with that. When I hear the ECR saying they're going to vote against, and the EPP are coming along with an alternative motion where they keep silent about sex education and sexual health rights, trying to avoid referring to access to abortion and contraception. Colleagues, it's 2015. Wake up. If we don't wage this battle, who's going to do it? I've heard a lot of dry talk about where the decision should be taken. Well, let me quote a wonderful woman, Marilyn Monroe. Women who want to be the same as men are lacking in ambition.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. And for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Ines Zuber.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you, President. It's important to have a strategy for equality between men and women, but it must be something in practice, not just some fine-sounding words. That's what's been lacking. We're going to support this report, but the fact is that equality concerns, particularly women's labour rights, cannot just be written off as if it's something completely separate from the main thrust of political decision-making. That's why the major political groups here need to recall that when they're taking their decisions on macroeconomics, they're cutting public services as a result around Europe. It's women who suffer the worst from this. When you force countries to cut their pensions, women suffer more too. They have lower wages, and the pensions even lower. Women are becoming less independent and more susceptible to violence. Women's maternity rights are being undermined. When you attack health services, then it's harder for them to get access to their sexual health rights. So what equality can there be? And then, may I just say that although we can back the report. I don't think you can talk about forced prostitution because in a capitalist society, if anyone's having to sell these services, by definition, prostitution is forced.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for 1 minute, Marie-Christine Arnautu. President, dear colleagues, I will stand against the NOICHL report, firmly so, because it's yet another step in the process of destroying a traditional family, despite appearances which they believe to be consensual. But my colleagues have already pointed this out. Gender equality is just a pretext. It's just an excuse behind this report. This report is actually a bit of a portmanteau report. It talks about gender ideology and various matters related to that. For instance, there's a paragraph on so-called discrimination against transgender people. What's that doing in there? Also, the fight against harassment and prejudice vis-à-vis LGBT people in schools. You know, why is that in there? It's a totalitarian report, really, conditioning the minds of young children. This is a very materialistic point of view of human beings, you know, reducing it down or boiling it down to sexuality only. We are fighting this ideology. It's very dangerous for our family structures, and it's also, I'm afraid, a violation of the principle of subsidiarity, dear colleagues, because when it comes to education and health, we know that it's the member states that have competences, and these competences must be respected. Thank you. Thank you, says the President. The next speaker for 2 minutes, Rosa Estaras Faragut.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Equal opportunities is a goal and a mission for all of us in this House. What doubt can there be? It's not something specific to any political party of left or right or centre. We have all signed up to the values of the European Union, and equality amongst us all is its highest value. Non-discrimination too. Now, it's true that the strategy to 2015 needs to be replaced because there's still a lot to be achieved, but above all in bringing an end to discrimination and squaring up to the main challenges in the world of work. There's still work to be done on the wage gap of 6.9%. We also have to work on pensions, and women are still not in the directorships to any significant extent. They're still dominated by men. We have to break through stereotypes and educate people for equality. Children have to be educated together in an inclusive education system. We also need to fight domestic violence, the greatest infringement of human rights and cause of inequality. Domestic violence, be it sexual, emotional or any other type of violence, undoubtedly flows from poor education inequality. And so we need to work very hard and do everything we conceivably can to prevent this. And wherever there is gender violence, we must speak out against it. It must not be left in the private sphere. We must prosecute relentlessly. Poverty has become a symbol for women. The most vulnerable sectors of society, such as single mothers or women with disabilities, older women, women from ethnic minorities, and the LGBT communities are hardest hit. We're all united in this struggle, and so I would call upon the left to show if these objectives are really so important to them, please separate out the issue of abortion, because that is where you are splitting us. And let's work together on what we share.
I have a blue card from our colleague Frunzulica. Do you accept that? Perdona? Hay una carta azul.
There's a blue card. Please.
Vielen Dank, Herr President. In fact, I enjoyed the presentation, the intervention of our colleague Estaras Faragut. I would like to ask her, because she mentioned the stereotypes and domestic violence, if new forms of violence against women, such as those found in social media, are also an urgent matter that needs to be dealt with. Thank you.
Sí, gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Yes, a very opposite point. Yes, new technologies and innovation has indeed introduced new types of gender violence. And voyeurism, cyber voyeurism, for example, and everything that's going on the networks. There's a great source of concern about this in schools. In Spain and quite a number of other EU countries, we've actually had cases of people being driven to suicide. So violence can be psychic violence now, cyber violence, not just old-fashioned physical violence. And we need to fight it on every front, whatever kind of violence it may be.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. And now, for 1 minute, I call Mark Tarabella.
Thank you very much, President. 3 months ago, we adopted my report on equality between men and women. That report proposed ambitious measures and have been taken on board in the NOICHL report. We, in particular, have called on the European Commission to set up in 2016 a year for violence against women. This was then followed by the written declaration that we had adopted with success, thanks to many members turning out in support of it. President interrupts, asks the speaker to slow down. Thank you. Mrs. NOICHL's report is once again a request of the Commission to take steps to fight violence against women, and so I would ask the Commission to come up with tangible proposals. And could I finish by asking colleagues of all stripes to support this NOICHL report, because it's important that we are united in our diversity, and maybe this report isn't entirely perfect for all of you, but this European Parliament is speaking out in favour of the rights of women. And the NOICHL report is the most ambitious and the most specific one we've had. So thank you for doing that for me 3 months ago. I would now call on you all to do the same for Mrs. NOICHL.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for 1 minute, Mr. Škripek.
Dear Chairman, this proposal, despite numerous recommendations, repeats an attempt to meddle inadmissibly with Member States' authority. In its effort to make interruptions a human right, it completely omits the primary human right, which is the right to life and its protection from conception, and it fails to respect another basic human right, which is the right to conscientious refusal of care of doctors, and it fails to respect the exclusive right of parents to bring up their children, and it dictates families how they should divide their family responsibilities. Now, Europe has had a bad experience with social engineering, and there is no law which can dictate how many women a company is going to employ or what each member of the family will do. So this is no area for the state to dictate, to tell you anything about. And there is work in the family done mainly by women. This has been underappreciated, and it is irreplaceable for the whole society. And it is absurd that the report for the equality between men and women completely neglects this fact.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. And now for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Thun.
Thank you, Chair. Lack of substantial equality in various areas of social life is still a problem for women in all over Europe. In the labour market, they still earn less than men on average. In most places, they are underrepresented at the top of the career ladder and are overrepresented in the less prestigious sectors of the economy. Women's potential is limited by the unequal distribution of household labour. However, I would like to single out the widespread problem of domestic violence. A major problem for the investigation of domestic violence cases is the reluctance of victims to report to the authorities. Often the reluctance to report is linked to the lack of faith in the ability of law enforcement to deal with these issues. A lack of shelters and financial dependence of offenders is another problem. The persistence of stereotypes concerning the roles and responsibilities of women and men in the family and society is another challenge. In some countries, obstacles to deal with cases of domestic violence may be related to the fact that they are cases of private prosecution. Many member states have no specific criminal provisions on domestic violence and marital rape, and rape is prosecuted within the framework of a private prosecution. Abolishment of private prosecution of domestic violence and rape may contribute to better protection of victims of crime. Estonia, my own country, is a good example of this context. We need a comprehensive fight against domestic violence at the EU level. Therefore, I would like to stress the importance of the recommendation to designate the European Year for combating violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, for 1 minute, Angela MLINAR.
Gracias.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the rapporteur for her work on this report and the FAM committee. We're doing our best to try to draw up a common equality strategy for Europe. I turn to you, Commissioner. We're here for you to listen to us. As you said in January, you want to rely on our work, and that is why we are tabling this report, asking the European Union to go well beyond the strategy of 2015, which unfortunately wasn't too successful. So it also needs to be pointed out that there are certain aspects which need to be improved upon of fundamental importance. For instance, prostitution. We need to make sure that sexual relations are not turned into a commodity, because that is really just a perpetuation of patriarchal culture. Women cannot be subjugated in this way, and they are unfortunately being forced into this activity by mafias. So that is why we need to talk about prostitution. And then also, when it comes to gender inequality and the root causes of that, I don't know why this Parliament is so fearful, and indeed the right side in this Parliament. Why don't you want to talk about the root causes, the origins? Unfortunately, none of our amendments were accepted, and I think it should be pointed out that the measures that have been implemented as a result of the crisis have just made the situation worse, also in terms of poverty. Thank you.
1 minute now, Kristina Morvai.
Köszönöm szépen.
Thank you very much. Indirect discrimination is something we talk about when you have a state decision. At first sight, it might not constitute discrimination, but actually its impact is a negative impact, and it does actually have more of an impact on one of the sexes rather than the other. I'm talking about women, of course, so a greater impact on women. And such indirect discrimination is what happens, for instance, in Hungary, because you've got one government after another, for instance, the current government, who took a decision when it came to carers, when it came to those who work in creches, in kindergartens, those who are working in the social sphere, those who are teachers. Basically, their wages are not increased. There's a freeze on wages. Their income is not increased. And this is 10 years down the road after we joined the European Union. So we still find ourselves in this disgraceful situation. The Hungarian state is in a disgraceful situation because a carer, for instance, earns something like 300 euros per month. That's all. And we're talking primarily about women. Do you think that women will not stand up and speak out against that? They are standing up, and they are on the streets, they are demonstrating. So please support them. They must be supported, and make sure that this issue is an issue that is taken on board by the European Parliament and included in its programme. Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Jetzt für 2 Minuten, Anna Zaborska.
Thank you. For 2 minutes now, Mrs. Zaborska.
Thank you, President, Commissioner. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. All people, men and women. However, this equality is not and shouldn't be understood as sameness. The presented report is going far beyond the framework of our treaties. It is a new and worse variation of the infamous Estrela report, which tries to take over powers of member states. It is in particular such ignorance which we show, and which is a reason for an increased mistrust of people in the EU, because you cannot trust anyone who makes use of any opportunity to break a valid deal. It is so that it might be the case that the right of children to know their parents, which is also enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, will be not included. The report includes also requirements to expand services of assisted reproduction for everyone, and in a way also the legalization of surrogate motherhood. This report forces on people lack of respect to human life and its dignity, forces on them the sameness and rights which are not counterweight by responsibility. It forces on social engineering based on gender ideology, which denies and attempts to censor natural sciences and human sciences. There are several parts of the text which I would like to support. However, I must reject the report, and I hope that everyone who has a good moral compass will join me in my effort. The only way we can do tomorrow is to reduce this evil and to vote in favor of the alternative resolution. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Zaborska. For 2 minutes now, Mrs. Ward.
I'd like to thank my colleague Maria NOICHL for the report, and also to all the men who've spoken in support of these progressive amendments today. Tomorrow's vote will determine much of the EU's gender equality strategy for years to come, affecting the lives of more than 250 million women and also 250 million men. And I am proud to be a good mother to 2 of them. From this chamber, we must issue a strong and ambitious call for action in view of a reality where 1 out of 3 women suffers from physical or sexual violence, the most large-scale violation of human rights in Europe. That is a reality we simply cannot accept. We need to have a clear strategy supporting victims of violence, providing access to justice, and have member states in the EU implement the Istanbul Convention on combating violence against women. We must also address the social causes of violence. We must call upon member states to implement strategies on education for gender equality and for sex and relationship education. Educating children and young people to respect one another, educating for reciprocity and consent is the key to combating the sexist cultural attitudes that enable violence. We must call for education against gender stereotypes, homophobia and transphobia. The representation of women in the media, in culture and in arts is also crucial for combating violence and for gender equality in general. Empowering women through positive role models, raising awareness of the diversity of gender roles, telling the stories of survivors of violence and of women's success stories in the fields of science, technology, business and society at large. We must also look to raise awareness and hear the stories of women in marginalised communities and their daily struggles. Women asylum seekers, migrants, women in rural communities, Roma, minority women, women with disabilities, women in rural communities, carers, LGBTI, women with mental health conditions, and any gender equality strategy must include all of these.
Thank you. For 1 minute now, Marek Jurek, please.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący. Aborcjonizm jest
Thank you very much, President. Promoting abortion is unfortunately one of the most influential and abhorrent ideologies and forms of discrimination, but unfortunately it's an ideology which has poisoned to many degrees this report, and there are millions of women, however, in Europe who wish to be respected in their calling, their vocation to be mothers, and they wish to be supported and upheld in that endeavour. And so allow me to refer to some polling data from Poland. A typical supporter of abortion is a young, wealthy, single man, and not a married, poor woman. And so we must now make sure that we represent women and their rights, and make sure that they can have those rights respected when it comes to their natural ability to bear children.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors que les peuples européens...
Thank you, President. While European peoples are bearing unprecedented migration as the economy deteriorates, this House seems to have as its priority gender ideology and the community agenda. Once again, citing great universal principles, we're being proposed a very sectarian manifesto to destroy natural traditional institutions. Children are being targeted in assisted reproduction, and unfettered resort to abortion. What's more shocking is that this is being defended on grounds of health and the fight against infertility. That's just a fig leaf to help spread these unnatural techniques and promoting surrogacy, thereby undermining parental links to children. The poorest women would thereby become procreation machines. This is the image of decadence being organized on behalf of a libertarian utopia.
There is Lara Comi in 2 minutes.
Grazie Presidente, caro Commissario.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, colleagues, once again, we have an attempt here to use a report on such an important issue as equality between men and women to undermine institutions in a way we can't agree with. Some are saying that we have to recognize the right to abortion as part of equality, seeing that as some sort of human right, and undermining traditional definitions of parental links to children. Well, what are the real limits? How far can we actually push things? I can't agree, and I think I'm speaking for the great mass of European citizens. They can't understand how it is that this Parliament gets so exercised in working on these issues, in some instances actually exceeding the limits in the division of powers between the European institutions and the member states, and ignoring the real relations between men and women and their relations in terms of equality in their daily lives. Where are we actually heading? We need to establish the right priorities, the proper goals that deserve support as we seek progress for people in our societies. So let's not use this as an escape lane to avoid tackling the real issues. Now, we need a balanced approach in applying our political action. We have this alternative motion. I would call on members from all the other groups to read it very carefully and support it. In my comments, I haven't dwelt on the issue that so many other colleagues have raised regarding children. I think that to protect children, very often we have to return to a childlike way of thinking ourselves, because otherwise we will too often go to extremes.
Thank you very much. And now I call Mrs. Ayala Sender for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President. Congratulations to the rapporteur for a rather balanced report, and I think it's very much in line with what this Parliament has done before. I don't quite understand the alternative resolution, because I don't think that's the right thing to do vis-à-vis the past. So this instrument that we've had so far has been useful in terms of equal pay, in terms of putting an end to sexist violence and equality when it comes to our external action. However, we've been short of funds. The European Union never grants itself the funds that we need in order to meet these big ambitions that citizens also want. Impact assessment has been rather limited. We didn't have deadlines, and I think it's important for us to make sure that Europe doesn't only set objectives but also mechanisms to roll them out. We can do this. We need to put an end to sexist violence, gender violence against women in everyday life. We also need to look at employment and maternity issues, and we need to, of course, act against prostitution and trafficking in women, or indeed feminicides, which we can't even put a figure to because the EU so far has not been able to come up with a definition, a comparable definition that would allow us to tackle the phenomenon and compare data. We also need an EU strategy in order to fight the impact of the crisis. When it comes to poverty, we need, of course, also to look at the manifold forms of discrimination against women, migrant women, poor women, ethnic groups, elderly women, and so on and so forth. There are so many different levels. We need to be leaders when it comes to this. The European Union needs to increase rights also outside of our own borders, work together to support women in the rest of the world, help them out and help ourselves. We as European women. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Petir for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I regret because the NOICHL report, which should provide guidelines to the European Union and the European Commission on the new strategy, has been used by certain groups to promote their radical and extreme demands. I don't think it is admissible that this Parliament is again looking at a report which interferes with Member States' rights and erodes the relations within the marriage and promotes abortion as a human right. According to the definition of sexual and reproductive rights of the Beijing platform, there is no way to promote abortion as a method of family planning. It is scandalous that this report is encouraging the European Union to finance abortion and sterilization of women in the poorer countries in the world instead of providing education and opportunities for self-employment. The report promotes regulations which will discriminate against private entrepreneurs, especially those in the service sector, which is unacceptable. This report cannot be remedied, and therefore my group has submitted an alternative resolution which calls for gender equality in the area of labour rights, in the area of access to the labour market, in securing the access to health, and also making women decision makers. I call on you to advocate the true equality among men and women in all areas of life, and also to give the opportunity to men and women to establish families and also to school their children, because the family is the place where we learn what kind of people we want to be, and this is why the European Parliament should support the family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. I now call Mrs. Dăncilă for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I congratulate the rapporteur for her approach, which wants to come with an answer to challenges. 20 years after adopting the objectives of the platform of Beijing, we see that the laudable intention of decision makers to have equality, gender equality in all walks of life is not applied and has not been, and not all the objectives have been reached at the European level, targeted at a genuine equality. We want a better distribution of tasks, of caring for children, and to make the most of women's skills and competencies. We should not overlook the fact that in the EU, 42% of those who are involved in agriculture are women, and 3 out of 10 farms at European level are managed by women. The European Commission, together with the Member States, need to contribute to promoting a strategy leading to more jobs for women in the rural area and implicitly securing decent pensions for retired women in the EU who live in precarious conditions. Many of them have worked in agriculture, many of them have no pensions or very small pensions. I will vote for this report because I believe we need a long-term strategy. We need an answer that most women expect from us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. And the next speaker is Mr. Kelly for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President.
This is not the first time that we have spoken about this subject, and unfortunately it's not going to be the last time either, because it's quite clear that there's a lot to be done still to achieve equality in this field in the European Union. And that's why it's a pity that we're not going to have an equivocal, clear, unanimous vote about this. Now, on the subject of subjects such as abortion and education, there are problems here. We have issues with this also in my country, in Ireland.
Average in the Gender Equality Index. In some areas we're good, in some areas we're not too good. For instance, in our national parliament, only 27 of the 166 TDs are female. And as a result of that, in next year's elections, parties will have to have 30% females in their candidates. On the other hand, here in Brussels and in Strasbourg, 6 of our 11 MEPs are women, and 12 of the 14 in the island of Ireland are women indeed. So things are improving in some respects, not in others. At the same time, I think some of the most powerful positions in Ireland are held by women. Taoiseach, Minister for Justice, Attorney General, Chief Justice, DPP, Garda Commissioner, the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly is an Irish woman, and 2 of our last 3 presidents, Mary McAleese and Mary Robinson, were excellent presidents. So that shows that if women are given the opportunity, they can do the job. So that is something we need to work on. One area, though, which we are not happy about is that, perhaps because of the recession, the pay gap between men and women has widened in Ireland to 14.4%. That's something that must be addressed as a matter of urgency.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. And the next speaker is Mrs. Jourová for 2 minutes.
Благодаря, госпожо председател. Искам да поздравя Мария Нойхен за отлично...
Thank you, Chair. I would like to congratulate Maria Neuchen for her excellent report. It has been some time now since we've seen such a clear paper with courageous decisions we are to support by voting for them, with a courageous vision of what politics should be like. Yet we have to be absolutely honest. We have not achieved very much. As for equality between men and women, they are good strategies and proposals, but we do not act on them, and hardly anyone will believe in our concern, given that the maternal leave directive is still being passed on between different European institutions. 1 in 3 women is subject to violence, while we are still wondering and pondering what year should be dedicated to the fight against violence. No one will believe us, given that women continue to be paid much lower salaries and pensions, many of them also work in the grey economy without any basic protection. No one is going to believe us if we talk about sovereignty or subsidiarity, while we refuse women their basic rights. We focus our efforts today on saving thousands of refugees on our external borders, yet we hear of a growing number of cases of exploitation of female refugees who work for miserable pay in order to save their families, and there are a growing number of cases of secondary traffic of women on European territory. If we fail to find the right decisions today, it will be too late tomorrow, and it is the failure of both the European Union and Member States. It's important to support the report Neuchen.
Thank you very much, Madam. And the next speaker is Mrs. Corazza-Bildt for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, President. Violence against women, according to this report, is used in a weapon of war in Ukraine, but also this is happening therefore in Europe today. The equality strategy is one where we must adopt a position of zero tolerance against violence against women. It doesn't matter where that takes place, whether it's sexual violence, violence against children or whatever. And European legislation must criminalise, prevent and fight against these heinous crimes, and it must be upheld. The Member States must ensure that they put a stop to trafficking and support the directives in this regard, and the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women is one that must also be upheld. Whilst it is tolerated, we will never have equality, and those outside of Europe who come from outside of Europe, for example Nigeria, should not be allowed to carry on female genital mutilation. So we need to ensure that women can work without discrimination, and we must reduce the gender pay gap. It's the path to independence is through being able to earn your own money. More women need to work. More women need to dare to start their own companies and be part of the economy. We must also make it easier for women to take their share of responsibility for children, and men and women must be able to share the career and the home. But we should turn maternity leave into parental leave, and nevertheless that remains a matter for the Member States. Madam President, it is clear for me that women must have a right to be able to determine what happens with their own body. All women should have safe access to reproductive health services. I think it's a shame that the Greens have kidnapped the equality issue. We've got to break out of the red-green ideology mould of the past. Women, this is a fight for dignity and responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mrs. Moody for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. In paragraph 64 of this report, it calls for the following: that compliance with gender equality should be considered a criterion for all EU-funded culture, education and research programmes, and asks the Commission to include a specific area of gender research within the Horizon 2020 programme. We know that women are severely underrepresented in science, technology, research and the digital sector. For example, and I quote, "Often there are more iPads in the room than there are women. It is shameful." In the UK, women make up under 30% of the information and communications technology workforce, comprising around 20% of computing graduates and 10% of app developers. There is forecast to be a labour shortage of STEM jobs of around 7 million by 2025, and women only make up 24% of science and engineering professionals. We know this is because women drop out of STEM and IT subjects very early in the education process. Female participation in IT apprenticeship programmes and computer science degrees is only 21% and 19% respectively. In secondary education, where girls choose their own subjects, only 8% of girls in the UK choose computer studies. So the EU has a social, moral and economic duty to ensure a gender focus and equal gender participation in STEM sectors. More women in science and technology is good for the economy. It's good for society. And above all, it is the right thing to do, because it gives women and girls a choice about how they want to lead their lives. The EU can help to achieve this in this report today by voting for it and ensuring gender issues are mainstreamed in Horizon 2020 programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. And I now call Mr. József Nagy for 2 minutes. Thank you very much. Madam President, today in the European Union we know that the gender pay gap is 16%. So depending on whether you're a man or a woman, you do the same job, 16% difference in terms of pay. You know, we would need quotas in order to make sure that women become leaders in society, in economics. And then when it comes to maternity and mothers, the fact that women have a right to maternity leave, whereas in fact often they're being penalized for going on maternity leave. You know, under those circumstances, I think it is really rather a disgrace that some political groups are trying to introduce completely extraneous subjects into such a debate. I think that's really wrong. And for that reason, I'm afraid I can't actually support the report because of these extraneous factors. These are issues that have nothing to do with the subject in hand, and I think you're making the report completely impossible by introducing these elements. As far as the EU is concerned, I think we're expecting tangible steps for men, for women, for equality. We want to look at economic issues. We want to look at society, equal opportunities in those areas. And we also need to, of course, recognize the difference between the sexes, the acceptance thereof, and making sure that these differences are used for the best of society. So we don't want some kind of uniform approach applicable to everyone. We are, after all, men and women, and each and every one of us should have an opportunity to thrive in life, to fulfill their potential. So what we need is specific steps, a series of specific steps in order to create genuine equal opportunities and gender equality in European Union. And that is why I would like to support the EPP alternative resolution that has been tabled to this report. Thank you, and only that.
Borzan.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Borzan for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I would like to thank Mrs. NOICHL for the job well done, and also for taking into consideration the contributions by colleagues. The latest gender equality strategy did not achieve good results, so this one has to be more ambitious. Gender equality is a precondition for realizing general goals of the EU, such as greater employment and smaller pay gap. I decided to put in amendments in which I asked for easier access to financing for projects for women entrepreneurs. But I do not believe that it is right to focus only on economic approach to gender equality, so I tabled amendments regarding sexual education in schools in order to more efficiently fight against prejudice and gender disequality. Now we can decide, shall we support a proposal by several political options of the European Parliament, and which was adopted at the Parliamentary Committee, or the later alternative proposal by one political option. Namely, we, members of the European Parliament, have to take decisions, have the obligation to take decisions which will positively affect the lives of EU citizens, and not those proposals which we already know will be only a dead word on paper. So the alternative proposal is nothing else but a bureaucratic document that doesn't do any good either, and does not involve the most important element of this fight, which is decreasing violence against women, fighting against double discrimination, for example, of the Roma, etc., and women with disabilities. Namely, this proposal ignores the fact that the EU, with its value systems, should be a role model to the world, from which we hear terrible news of violence against women. And as a reporter of the Siena project, I am disappointed that the EPP has not seen the importance of the budgeting for this, which makes this only a word on paper. I therefore support the proposal of Mrs. NOICHL.
Do you accept it?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Gericke, you have the floor.
Well, I don't know whether you've looked at the EPP ECR report at all. What I'd be interested to know is that, well, we keep talking about this pay gap, which is supposed to be 16%. Now, mothers have a pay gap of 40%. That 40% pay gap, is that taken into account in the NOICHL report at all, I wonder? Or is motherhood perhaps something that also belongs in the Middle Ages?
Absolutely ne smatram.
I absolutely do not believe that mothers and motherhood is something that belongs in Middle Ages. But I do believe that in every member state, according to the system of subsidiarity, mothers and motherhood can have appropriate support, financial support. Therefore, I do not believe that the strategy has to contain all the elements, because some of the elements can be regulated in the respective member states.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Toms.
Thank you for the floor. In my speech, I will concentrate on what I find very important area where gender equality has not been achieved in full, and which is also an area where in a relatively short time we could achieve a progress. And this is the participation of women in companies and leading positions in the economy. It is unacceptable that there are still big differences when it comes to the participation and membership on the most important boards. Compared to men, women in the European Union are better educated, and according to various studies, the better equilibrium between men and women can improve the competitiveness of the European Union and improve its position on international markets. Why is not that happening? If we really want to achieve a progress, we have to make changes in the education process itself. It is the education process which should encourage entrepreneurship and break stereotypes about men bosses. Stereotypes are still very present in the corporate sector, in politics, in society at large, and I believe that the European Commission and the European Parliament did a lot, but I hope that the Council will find a suitable solution and continue negotiations on the Women on Board Directive. The first responsibility lies with the Member States, that is true, and the system of quotas does bring certain results, although I have still some reservation in that respect.
Thank you very much, Madam. And the next speaker is Mr. Niedermüller for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President. First and foremost, I would like to give thanks to the rapporteur for this excellent report. It really is forward-looking. I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that gender equality is one of the basic principles, basic values of the European Union, and that is precisely why we need to tackle discrimination against women, violence against women, also poverty in older age for women. These are indeed European issues. They're not just something that fall within the remit of member states. And we can, of course, refer to subsidiarity, but nevertheless, these are European problems and problems for European societies. What we need is a report that is forward-looking, not one that tries to hide behind anachronisms and conceal societal problems by doing that. We have to face the fact that there is discrimination against women, which hits some people particularly hard, those who are marginalized by society already, those who live in poverty. We're not just talking about discrimination against women, we're also talking about discrimination because of ethnic belonging. For instance, Roma women, that's a good example, or indeed those women who are in poverty, who are not very well educated, they don't have enough training, and for that reason they cannot get a job, and if they do get a job, then unfortunately they have to work under very undignified conditions. What we need is a new strategy, a new way of tackling things, a new approach, and we also need to make sure that we pay special attention to women whose skills have changed, or skill needs have changed, also the elderly, the LGBTI community, the Roma community. I think that the European Commission needs to do whatever it can in order to come up with new education programs and training programs for these members of society. That's the only way of going forward. It's the only way of tackling all forms of discrimination against women. We must put an end to all of it. We can't forget these people. These people find themselves in dire straits, in poverty. That's why we need quality education. We need to have help in terms of children's education, social support, social benefits, and we need special programs. Without that, we won't be able to move forward at all. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And the next speaker is Mrs. Ribeiro for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. More than 35 years since the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, we're still working out strategies to ensure equality between women and men in the European Union. That's a very sorry state of affairs. Nonetheless, the report we are debating is ambitious. It provides the means to achieve its objectives. Madam Commissioner, although we're familiar with the progress of the European Union on gender equality, and the fact that we are both in a position to be here debating this matter in this Parliament tonight, there's still a long way to go. You can't deal with differing things in the same way. We need to look at everyone's specific needs. I think that has to be the new paradigm for gender equality, and so I would defend a position where men and women have the same basic rights in access to fairly paid work in equal conditions, and in the political sphere, and sharing family rights too. But the key piece to underpinning every type of equality is, of course, education. Power, knowledge is power, and so we need to create the necessary conditions for access to education for all women and men, so that right from an early age we can fight against the kind of stereotypes that throughout their lives inhibit the full development of people's personalities. We need to contribute to a fairer society, and with that in mind, I think it's important to make the full use of the existing tools available to us, such as the Istanbul Convention. Physical, ideological and religious violence are still sorry realities. Women need our help. So they're still victims of the system, and a lot remains to be done.
Thank you very much, madam. And the next speaker is Mrs. Post for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying that I wasn't here for the start of the debate, but what I've heard is real anti-feminist policy coming from that side of the room. It's totally unacceptable in a modern EU this year, 2015. Well, we need a new equality strategy that is targeted to the future and the values that we support in the EU. We talk about discrimination on the basis of gender. This is exactly what is happening. It's a legitimization of this kind of discrimination. Now, we're talking about equality, but we need to talk about discrimination on the basis of gender. I think the report is extremely good, and I'd like to thank the rapporteur for it. It really gets to grips with inequality, and it tries to focus on those things that create the inequality between men and women and that don't really fit into any conventional categories. It's important that we do get a strategy for women's rights and gender equality in Europe. I'm really delighted that the report has stressed that it would be beneficial to promote equal opportunities for all sections and all both genders, for men and women, therefore at all levels throughout Europe, including those who have women that have a migration background, minorities, and those that maybe are marginalized in society. I think that we need to take a pretty broad perspective on this issue of inequality. It's about ultimately human rights, and we need to have equality, but we shouldn't deprive women of the right to abortion or determine their own what happens with their own bodies. I think the EPP is really trying to drag us backwards, and really they're trying to oppose what the European Parliament has adopted previously. So we support an equality policy where we really can ensure that women and men are properly equal. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Mr. Scheinfeld for 2 minutes.
Dziękuję, Pani Przewodnicząca. Sprawa równości ludzi wobec prawa.
Thank you very much. Equality. The right to equality, equality between people, that is one of the greatest civilizational challenges that we face. And to take a leadership role in this area is precisely what the EU has chosen to do. We have to unfortunately overcome inequality in our member states. We also have discrimination against women, which is part of that picture. We have differences in terms of treatment. Now, how can we overcome this? Well, I think we must think about education. Education, schools, these are the most important instruments in terms of overcoming stereotypes. And also making sure that these issues are taken seriously, that there's awareness, because sometimes tradition comes in, religion comes in, and that can give a warped perspective. We need to, of course, make sure that there's no blocking of progress by conservative forces. So, really, as politicians, we are called upon to act, particularly in the member states, of course. Politicians in our member states need to take these responsibilities on board. There was another point that I wanted to raise, a third point that I wanted to flag, where we need radical changes. The whole issue of the labour market, employment, the pay gap, and the fact that working time, flexibility of working time, these are really important concepts. Women need to be able to develop their full potential just as men do. Until we have that, we will not have equality. In terms of the strategy, I think that what is suggested here is very much in tune with what we would like to see too. Thank you.
Scheinfeld, you have a blue card from Ms. Gill. Do you accept? Do you accept it?
Bardzo proszę.
Yes.
Yes.
President, I agree with Mr. Sensveld that educating children and young people is key to achieving gender equality and especially ending, I think, violence against women. And teaching boys and girls to respect one another is really important. But do you think that representation of women and of girls and boys in the media is also a problem, that we need to address that as well as having policies addressing education too at the same time? So we need to address both as a priority.
Mr. Scheinfeld?
Jestem przekonany, że w tej sprawie należy edukacja.
Thank you. I'm convinced that education is a concept to be understood broadly. I'm not just talking about education in our schools. I'm not just talking about children or young people, because I'm convinced that in many member states of the European Union, what we have at the moment is a level of education that is insufficient. But like I said, I'm not just talking about children, young people. I'm also talking about educating adults. In other words, combating stereotypes, cliches, preconceived ideas. And once again, sometimes this has to do with religion. Religion might be a cause behind some of these ideas. That too needs to be tackled. And I'm talking about adults that time around.
There is Ms. Rosier.
Thank you, Madam President. They spend twice as much time as men doing housework and taking care of children. Their pay is always lower than that of men. Their rights are regularly challenged, and a third of them have already experienced sexual or physical violence. This is the situation that women face in the European Union today. Abortion, assisted reproduction for all couples, sexual education or reform of maternity leave, these are the solutions that have been proposed to fight against inequality and prejudice. And the text of Maria NOICHL is a very progressive text in that regard. maybe it's a little bit too progressive for some, because an alternative resolution has been tabled by the EPP, and that resolution tries to backpedal on some of the fundamental achievements for women. No reference to equality of genders, no budgetary commitments, no reference to abortion. Basically, it's moving backwards for women, even for those things that are easy to solve, the employment for women and their working conditions. The Conservatives refuse to allow women full refuse to allow them to avail themselves of the full sexual and reproductive rights. They manoeuvre and they misinform people and use the pretext of assisted reproduction of abortion to justify refusing the equal conditions for men and women in the professional world. So women tend to have less access to the labour market. There's more inequality. They have lower pay than men. They're less, and yet they tend to be affected more by unemployment. They tend to be having to look after children, even when they have a male partner. And so women in the labour market tend to be better qualified, but even with better education, they don't necessarily get a job that is in line with their educational level. And so we need this plan in Europe to bring about equality, and it is a good thing that this report is proposing more flexible forms of work so that men and women can actually better reconcile their professional and family lives. And after the Mark Tarabella report, I hope that we will now manage to support this report and provide this new impetus for men and women in Europe.
Thank you very much. The next and last speaker is Mrs. Giuffrida for 1 minute. 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente. Quest'Aula si è spesso...
Thank you, President. Very often there's been confrontation in this House when it comes to women's rights. Unfortunately, the reality is there are issues there that we can't ignore. Maternity leave, feminine genital mutilation, sex crimes, various issues within the debate to show how urgently we do need a strategy on equality between men and women. It has to be followed through with clear policies which will be effective. I don't believe that one or two pieces of legislation will suffice to change things. It's important in upholding people's rights, which are often overlooked. But what we need above all is a culture shift, which can only start in education and training. That's why we need funds and resources, not just fine wishes. And since you can't get equality with a directive, what we need to do is to teach our boys and girls to respect one another. That's what we need to be working towards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Honourable members, that brings an end to the individual speakers in this debate. We now move on to Catch the Eye. I will be able to give the floor to all members who have asked for the floor. Mr. Caputo was my first person on the list, but I understand that he is not in the chamber right now, so I now call Mr. Frunzulică. You have the floor, sir.
Very much, Madam President. Dear colleagues, I strongly support the adoption of a new separate strategy on gender equality and women's rights in the European Union. It is especially important to prioritise the fight against violence against women. New forms of violence against women, such as those found in social media, are also an urgent matter that needs to be dealt with. We should be very active on combating violence, tackling pay gaps, and on ensuring that women can reach equal positions in the working world. I especially support the new approaches for reconciliation of private and professional life introduced in the report, to be dealt with a strong focus on care and working time arrangements. I truly thank the rapporteur and the shadow for the great job done, and I am sure that it will have a very positive outcomes in the societies in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker, Mr. Marias.
Madam Chairman, in today's economy, the efficient implementation of the policy for gender equality has the highest priority. In the countries of the European South, the austerity measures of Merkel led the women into the margin and the very poor. In Greece, 60% of the unemployed are women, and there are 518,000 women. unemployed. 15.7% of these unemployed women have an unemployment benefit. And the unemployment of women in 2009, before the memorandum, was 14.4%. In 2014, the rate is 29.3%. Also, there is a pay gap between men and women. It has increased significantly. The public sector has been destroyed, and we have flexible work, and so women are desperate concerning jobs. Inequalities between men and women have negative results for society, and because of the inequalities, these societies cannot create a sustainable growth and social cohesion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Mr. Jakovčić.
Thank you, Ms. President. I was very happy when I saw the information that this report was adopted with the majority at the committee, because that means that finally this Parliament will adopt this report speaking primarily about basic values of the EU, equality between men and women, about freedom for all people, for all individuals. Unfortunately, in the debate today we have seen many differences, and of course ideologies have been pulled here, but of course we have our own different ideologies and belong to different political groups, but some things have been adopted jointly at the committee. But when speaking about subsidiarity, I'm one of the people who believe that things should be dealt with at the local or regional level, so I actually cannot adopt the principle of subsidiarity here, because I think this is about higher values, freedom, etc.
Thank you. Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Eserich.
Thank you. We talk about equality post 2015. I take you back to a time a young girl grew up during the Second World War in England. She was from a lower class background than most of the rulers we've ever had in England. She grew up to win a record number of elections in our country. She defeated the hard left in our country. She defeated the Soviet Union and won the Cold War. She went on to fight for liberty and freedom, and at every step of the way, Margaret Thatcher never once had an EU directive or a helping hand or a quota. So in the spirit of freedom that Mrs Thatcher put forward, when you speak of gender quotas for business, sex education and PC indoctrination in schools, and the amount of housework that men should do being dictated to from here, well, as the lady would say, no, no, no.
Thank you. That brings the Catch the Eye part of the procedure to an end, and I now call Mrs. Jourová on behalf of the Commission.
Ladies and gentlemen, the European Parliament has always been a driver and an important partner for change for gender equality. In today's discussion on NOICHL's report, I heard here a very strong voice on the necessity to have a strong and comprehensive EU policy to promote equality between women and men. I count on your support to continue our journey towards an equal Europe, and I reiterate the Commission's strong commitment to equality between women and men, backed by concrete policy actions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And now I call the rapporteur, Mrs. NOICHL, for 2 minutes. When the right to vote was introduced for women, was that progress or was it gender ideology? When women were allowed to open their own bank accounts, was that gender ideology or was it progress? And when rape was finally considered a crime, was that gender ideology or was it actually progress? These are the kinds of thoughts running through my mind today, having listened to some of the contributions in the debate. I thought these kind of contributions really belonged in the past. I have an appeal to put out to you, and I'm calling upon the EPP and on other Conservatives in the House. An appeal to you. Please be honest vis-à-vis your voters. Please be honest. This is an own initiative report. It's not a legislative proposal. Please be honest, and please also point out that this is not something that's going to be transposed into domestic legislation immediately. It's a message that this House is trying to send out. And please be honest. Do not make allegations about things that are actually not in the report. For instance, a lot of people referred to the report about surrogacy. There is nothing about surrogacy in my report, and yet you've referred to it repeatedly, so please be honest. You know, ideology is something that you're pushing here, not so much us. Also, an appeal to all of my colleagues in the House. 20 votes in favour, 12 against. The report was supported by a collective body. It's not my report anymore. It was something that was approved by the committee, so it has committee support, and therefore I would call upon you today, please, to refer back the EPP alternative resolution, and please support this report. We've been working on it for months and months. Please support it. And I turn to you, Madam Commissioner. I have an appeal for you as well. This report for you is a basis, it's a premise, and then you start doing your work in the Commission, its strategy and what you need to do for the future. And I would like to make it clear from my own perspective, and on behalf of the FAM committee as well, I would like to make it clear that we will be there by your side to support you whenever you need us. We're talking about a first step here, something that we're deciding for the citizens of Europe. The second step is the step to be taken by your institution. I very much hope today that we'll take the right first step, and then the ball will be in your court. Thank you, Madam.
Thank
you very much to the rapporteur for her concluding thoughts. That concludes the debate, honourable members, and the vote will take place tomorrow. We move on to the next item on our agenda, which is 1-minute speeches. And I would like to call, first of all, Mr. Claude Rollin, the first speaker.
Thank you, Madam President. We need hardly stress here that the challenge posed by unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. We cannot tolerate seeing a generation being sacrificed. 5 million young people, more than 50% of young people in some countries are unemployed. It's unacceptable. The youth guarantee is coming into place. Extra resources have been marshalled. That's significant, but we need to redouble our efforts. Too many young people are leaving the school system without qualifications, and there are too many jobs not being filled because they can't find properly trained candidates. All the stakeholders now recognise the need to develop sandwich courses. There are systems available and they work. So let's draw the consequences of this and set up an ambitious European system of sandwich courses, alternating education and training in Europe. We need to get the social dialogue going again. The trade unions and employers' organisations agree with our analysis, and the Commission should bring them together to bring out an agreement on sandwich courses.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mrs. Dodds.
Thank you. The second reading of an EU referendum bill will take place tomorrow in the British House of Commons. It looks like the referendum will occur next year. Till then, David Cameron has said he'll focus on trying to renegotiate Britain's relationship with the EU. Labour MEPs have been fighting for many years to reform Europe. We've argued that the EU budget must focus more on promoting jobs and growth, that national parliaments should engage more with EU policy making, and that where EU regulations aren't working, they must be changed. But Cameron is taking Britain's name in vain in these negotiations. His plans include abandoning tightening up the Posted Workers Directive, making wage undercutting worse, not better. He's also trying to dilute protections within the Working Time and Agency Workers Directives and the Social Chapter. Yes, we need EU reform, but we need reform that works for employees, for pensioners, for the unemployed, and for the vast majority of businesses that accept the need for a minimum floor of protections at work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mr. Dzhambazki.
Thank you, Madam President, dear colleagues, Madam Commissioner. The proposal made by the European Commission to establish quotas for the resettlement of illegal immigrants throughout the European Union is scandalous, and it affects directly my country's, Bulgaria's, interests. Bulgaria accepted 2.5 times more immigrants than Italy and Spain, and almost the same times more than Greece. So the quotas proposed by the European Commission are unjustified and run against my country's national interest. Article 73, therefore, should be invoked, and there should be solidarity on an equal basis among the member states. Anything else would be a withdrawal from justice and equity. I insist that the European Commission should revisit its decision and declare Bulgaria as a country under particular pressure. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't see Mrs.
Thank you. I don't see Ms. Tom, so I will give the floor now to Ms. Harkin.
Thank you. Today, Wolfgang Muncher said it clearly. Greece needs to survive and eventually to prosper within the Eurozone. Anything less than that is surely not acceptable to the Greek people. With a 25% drop in income and debt piling up on all sides, the Greeks know that more of the same simply won't work. And if the rest of the Eurozone doesn't see what's in front of their noses, then they're just plain stubborn, they're happy to play with fire, or they simply don't care. This week, many of us will speak of the geopolitical importance of a trade deal with the US, and indeed we are right. Yet, at so many different levels, we have a geopolitical crisis sliding towards disaster within the Eurozone. Whether your cold logic tells you that we must preserve an intact Eurozone, or whether your social conscience cannot live with the impacts of the economic crisis on Greek citizens, it doesn't matter, because this has gone way beyond politics. European politicians have to stop playing to the gallery, whether it's Brussels, Strasbourg, Athens or Berlin.